friends, welcome to episode 174 of Storyteller Conclave. This is a show all about helping you run the best tabletop role-playing game that you can, whether you're a new storyteller or dungeon master learning the craft, or an experienced storyteller looking to take your game to the next level. I'm Sarah.
I'm Rob.
How we doing, Rob?
You know, I'm hopefully not going to cough a lot.
Okay.
I've had coughing fits, so I apologize. I will be trying to cough to the side when it does happen, but it's just started this morning. I think I got some, weather drainage, because I look outside and I'm seeing things like in that fluffy bloom again, and I'm like,
yeah.
oh, we're having like second spring.
Yeah.
This is great.
Yeah.
I think it's just the storms that rolled through kind of riled everything up.
Yeah, I think so.
So, I apologize for the voice shift and any coughs that may come out unprotected. So
we have a hot pot of tea between us here with some honey in it, and it is therapy night.
It's also Scotch honey, which is even better.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Yeah, so this should help just a little bit. But we don't really have anything that's happened in the last week, and this topic opened up wide, which was good.
Yeah.
Like, I kind of felt that it was going to. It's not a 101. We're going to get a little deep into this.
Yeah, I think so.
And we've got some great questions.
I think it's okay.
So
tonight we're talking about stories that do not have a villain.
Yes.
And I think, like, I think a lot of, like, especially, like, even just the examples we give, like, if we're just tossing out, oh, here's how you do this plot, here's how you write this type of character, we always have, like, if your big bad evil guy is blah, 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 your big bad evil guy this, big bad evil guy that.
Yeah.
But what, do you need a big bad evil guy? Is that an essential staple in a story? And I think the answer, as we're going to explain tonight, is resoundingly no.
No, but I will say this, in doing some of the research that I was going through, I found a lot of people saying the same thing at a high level, that it's easy to have a big bad evil guy. It's easy to have a focus point.
Oh, sure it is.
It's hard to perfect them, but it is really easy to just say, like, yeah, that guy's just an evil guy doing evil things.
Sure.
You
can even make him misunderstood or whatever. There's a billion ways to write a villain, but I think it's narratively easy because you give a face and a voice to the thing that the players can hate. They can point a finger at the villain and go, "That's the guy we hate," and he can go, "Ha ha ha," and twist his mustache and do something awful, like kick a puppy, and they go, "Oh, that was awful," and you've got instant gratification.
Well, and not only that, the players don't even have to hate the villain.
Mm-hmm.
The players have to have zero investment. It can just be a job to go take care of the problem. Mm-hmm. And that problem is the villain. And a villain is something easy to shift, is easy to have things be other things acquainted with them. But everybody that I was writing about where you remove the villain becomes a challenge for the writer. And two, if you can master this, you're going to be way better at villainy.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the big things that resounds in all of this is the understanding between an antagonist and a villain. And we kind of went back and forth with the Oxford terminology versus, story terminology versus legitimacy versus everything else, and kind of had to come to our own terms with it.
Yeah, you started. You had a bunch of examples written down. We'll get into those examples in a little bit here, and we were kind of going through them, talking through together. And I was like, I don't know if that's a villain. That's more of an antagonist. I don't know if that's a villain. That's And we had to kind of really sit down and define what the difference between an antagonist and a villain is. And so for those of you out there who don't know the difference, we always try to start with definitions so that we all know what words we're working with here.
Yes,
okay?
yes. Let's all get a common definition in here.
So there is a difference between an antagonist and a villain.
Yes.
So antagonist is the opposite of a protagonist. Okay, the protagonist is just the main character of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Does not have to be a good guy.
Yep.
Does not have to be someone you agree with.
Yep.
Does not have to be someone on a moral high ground. No, it is just literally the main character of the story. If the main character of the story is an asshole, your protagonist is an asshole, and that's just how it happens.
That's how it happens.
Okay. An antagonist, again, does not have to be a bad guy. They're just someone who stands in the way of your protagonist. There's someone who complicates the situation for the protagonist.
So a cop, if the person is trying, like Punisher is trying to do things, and the police are there examining the crime scene, they're not necessarily the villains, they're just antagonists.
Correct.
They're
The Punisher,
in the way.
who is standing there murdering people, is the protagonist.
They were all
and the
bad.
cops, the lawful good cops trying to arrest him,
Mm-hmm.
are the antagonists
Correct.
in that situation.
Yep.
Simply because the Punisher is the main character of the story. All right. Now, that said, villains and heroes are the other dichotomy, and they are, I would say, all villains are antagonists, but not all antagonists are villains.
I agree with that statement.
All right. So villains are when you actually have bad guys doing bad stuff. They are the opposite of heroes.
Yes.
Heroes come in a lot of varieties, but oftentimes what defines a hero, whether they are an anti-hero or just a flawed hero in general, like the Punisher.
Yep.
I mean, the Punisher only kills bad guys. He is, in a sense, a hero. We may not agree with his methods, but he is at least trying to do something good for the world.
Yes.
And we can get into that all night, but we're not gonna. We're just going to take that on face value.
And when we started defining this, we finally got to one point where we had the perfect test.
Yes.
The villain lampshade test.
The villain lampshade test.
If you're familiar with the lampshade test, which is actually
I think it's the sexy lamp test is what it's called.
Is that and it comes down to, I can't remember.
If you can take a female character in a piece of media and replace them with a sexy lamp, and it does not affect the story in any meaningful way.
Yep.
If the story can still proceed, all the major beats can happen, all the characters can accomplish whatever goals they've got going on, then that is not a true female character.
And that's actually the
Bechdel test.
Bechdel test.
It is not the Bechdel test.
Well,
the Bechdel test is different, but it is
within that vein.
It's a feminist litmus test.
Thank you.
Very much of the same vein.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we came up with the villain lampshade test, which is if you can remove the person from the story and the problem still exists for the PC, they are not the villain.
Yes, if the problem stem directly from the villain, if you can remove a character from the story and that problem does not go away, they weren't the villain, they're just an antagonist.
Yes. So I love the simplicity of this. I think it helps define very quickly what it is and what it is not within the story that you're working with, and I hope this propagates out as much as anything else, because I would love to see this being used by anyone, anywhere.
I adore it. I adore it. The villain lampshade test. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your enemies.
Marvel Civil War, who are the protagonists and antagonists? Well, okay, protagonists are the heroes.
Well, let's preface that for our listeners, please. That was a question from Knox in the Box in the live chat.
That's a good teardown. I think that's I think trying to remember everybody involved in the Civil War is interesting, but it is not a dichotomy. It is a split view story. So you have to understand that both sides are technically pros and antis depending on the perception. So it's no different than if you took Wheel of Time breaks the character stories up sometimes when you're getting different views.
Yes.
That same thing occurs. So remember that your protagonist is always the first-person view. So if it's the story is being presented through them, 9 times out of 10, that's where it's coming from. Now, that is not true for villainy. If the villain is the view of the story, meaning you're getting to see the villain side of the story, that is merely foreshadowing. That's all you're getting out of that. So that doesn't apply. But as a hero is moving the plot forward within the story, you can have different heroes be antagonists or rivals. Keep in mind that is a different state. But truly in that story, none of them can be defined. I would say they are not antagonists in that story. They are truly rivals because they are trying to get to the same result. They're all heroes, but they can be rivals.
Yeah, it's one of those weird situations where the protagonist does actually shift around who's a protagonist and who's an antagonist. Depends on the perspective of the story. Overwatch asks, so is Darth Vader not the villain of A New Hope? The Death Star and Empire are still there. If he goes away, he is a villain.
Yeah.
There are multiple villains in A New Hope.
Correct.
He is specifically a villain counter to Luke's hero. Luke and Obi-Wan's hero.
Correct.
If he goes away, so the Death Star and the Empire are still there, true. But of the Jedi story of Luke and Obi-Wan versus Darth Vader, that goes away.
Correct. But the actual, if we look at it within the crawl, and what the statement is that the rebels are trying to get the plans for the Death Star so they can destroy it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is not classified as a villain by story definition.
No, again, not by the opening crawl.
Correct.
But he's very much presented as one.
Correct.
We don't see the. don't think we see the Emperor in the first movie, or if we do, it's that like brief hologram scene with the bad makeup.
I think you're accurate in that. If I remember correctly.
he's not posed as a major player, and so all of our focus on the Empire is focused around him. But yeah, I would still say he's a villain because he's a villain in the Jedi sense of you've got two good wizards and there's an evil wizard that acts as a foil to them.
Mm-hmm. But if he's removed from the story, does the Empire and Rebellion still sit as the main plot line of the story? And I would say yes.
Yeah, it does. But I mean, you can have multiple, like we showed with the Civil War thing. There's multiple ways of doing it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I kind of feel like we're getting in the weeds here on what is a villain, and we're really here to talk about how do you tell stories without them.
Yes, and so we want to make sure we understand what removing them really means.
Right. So, there is kind of a trope of not having a villain.
Yep.
So rather than telling your story straight up as a good guy versus bad guy story, the central conflict is going to be caused by other forces and does not feature characters in direct opposition to each other. Okay? So you can have a we're all on the same team and we're in this together story. You don't have anybody opposing you, but you can still have a lot of conflict and trauma, in drama. The trauma and drama.
I think all that's true.
The thing you have to remember is that conflict is what breeds drama.
Correct.
Okay? Your conflict does not have to stem from a person, or it really doesn't even have to come from anything nefarious. Okay? As long as something can create stress among your protagonists, it can create conflict, and from there, drama can be bred.
Agreed. It can be an internal struggle. That is perfectly fine. There's nothing to say that it isn't. And this applies across all genres. We've seen it in multiple places. In fact, it's kind of more prolific and well defined in video games than we really ever have had it in the past. It's just not common, in the sense that because a video game is done in a single perspective, it is very easy to define and say we're just removing villainy here. We're removing the villain.
Yeah.
An older one, if you are familiar with it, whether you've found it along and maimed your way to playing it, and or some retro version of it, or you played it back in the day.
This game is legendary, but only if you were like gaming in the 80s.
Yeah. So Ultima 4 removed a villain as the main plot point and made the story about basically you discovering yourself as a character, which I think is fantastic. I never got to play it, but I did understand that it was a different game, and it was very long and very involved and very challenging.
Yeah.
Because it would examine you through your actions of how honest you were, how compassionate you were, how courageous you were, how pious you were. Like all of those things were included, and that changed the story as you progressed it.
Yeah.
Nier Automata is another one where there is no central villain. There is a story about what is happening, and it is an examination of that story.
Yeah.
We both played Ark.
Oh yeah,
Survival Evolved, which a lot of people say it's a survival game. There's dinosaurs, and you're hanging out, you're building stuff, you're doing things. There is a bit of a story there if you choose to go after it.
Yeah, but it's pretty thin, pretty avoidable, and I would say really only pops up in like the later expansions. But especially early on in the game, even if you are paying attention to the story, the villain really isn't there. It's mostly a man versus environment story.
Yeah.
It's just you're on an island with a bunch of dinosaurs. Survive.
Yeah, and not to give too much of a spoiler here away, but the truth of, and it's been out for too long, so just deal with it. Ark itself, I think, falls under the same category a lot of things like D&D does, is like the villain doesn't matter until you interact with that portion of the story, and then suddenly it becomes the villain.
Yeah.
The villain shows up in that. And I think that's almost a direct tie from doing a tabletop role-playing style where it's like your players, the villain doesn't even recognize the players exist until they come in contact and then become an issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really where the conflict becomes one-on-one, until at that point. Minecraft. You love Minecraft.
I love Minecraft.
It's
modded specifically, but yeah. I mean, really all your survival stories, anything that fits into the man versus environment style storytelling is going to be great with that. Hulavu in the live chat tosses in the board game Pandemic.
Again, perfect example.
Yeah, how are you gonna? I mean, is the virus a villain? It doesn't really give a crap. It's not really doing anything on purpose. It's just doing what it's designed to do.
Anytime that time becomes the villain, which is really what it is, it's not a villain. Some movies, Finding Nemo.
Yep.
There's no true villain in that. It is a discovery story.
Yeah, it's a discovery story.
And that is a journey.
Yeah.
Armageddon is a giant asteroid that is hurtling itself toward Earth. A story? A villain? No, it's not. It's an event.
Yep.
Interstellar. It's a discovery story about going. Now,
man versus black hole.
Pretty much, how many years did we just lose doing this? Is a great point of that. Is time's the real challenge there? Is trying to get things done in time to save Earth. You could say that there are definitely antagonists along the way, without a doubt.
Sure. Sure.
But they're not villains.
Yeah.
I was reading, and somebody had pointed out that in the Prisoner of Azkaban, you actually have not a red herring.
A villain who turns out not to be a villain.
Yeah. So it's a ruse of a plot. Yeah. So it is presented whole cloth as at the beginning of this that Sirius Black is the villain, and we're going to show you all of the things throughout the story that make Sirius Black the villain of the story. And at the end, I'm going to be like, all of that is just accidents and coincidences.
Mm-hmm.
And you were looking at it through the wrong perspective. So, in that sense, it also doesn't really have a villain in the story, because Voldemort, the main villain of everything, isn't present in the story.
Yeah.
It's just not there. Alice in Wonderland is another story with no direct villain. Lots of antagonists. Presenting a very challenging world, and they're always presenting it as this is dangerous. In a different light.
Yeah. I mean, towards the end, the Red Queen kind of becomes a villain-ish character, but I would say for the vast majority of it, it's just Alice dealing with Trippy Land
and being told from questionable folks, this world is scary and spooky, and I'm gonna point to something that makes this world even more scary.
Yeah.
Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was the other one that I threw in here because I thought it was a good example of antagonists, which were originally penned as villains, but we both agreed at the end, we're like, that's a bad term. They're not villains, they're antagonists.
Yeah, agreed.
And I mean, they're all jerks. Don't get me wrong. Some of them aren't necessarily even villainous,
right? But they're more exemplars of vice than they are villains, in that they don't stand in direct opposition to Charlie.
Correct. They're just there to be in the way.
Yeah.
And also to point out the flaws in the world, the setting itself, in a very clean way. He is of a poverty level, impoverished, unable to make men's, barely able to eat properly and take in and have any value for his family. And these are people of gluttony, of vanity, of wealth, of greed, trying to garner more than they ever need, just to continue that process. So it's a show and tell, if you will, as the story continues. So
now I'm going to do a little aside here, because we mentioned Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, we mentioned Alice in Wonderland.
Yes.
And Knox in the Box dropped the word Jabberwocky into the live chat here.
Sure.
Now I don't know if many people know this. I know people old school D&D players always know about the Vorpal sword. Right?
Yes.
When you rolled a critical hit, it would behead your enemy.
Correct.
Sort of thing. So that actually comes from the poem Jabberwocky.
Yes.
Vorpal is not a real word.
Mm-mm.
I mean, in the sense that it means anything.
Yep.
It was invented by Lewis Carroll in the line from the Jabberwocky. There's a poem within the story Alice in Wonderland.
Yep.
He says, 1, 2, 1, 2, and through, his Vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with his head he went garumphing back.
Yep.
He beheaded the Jabberwocky with his Vorpal sword. So yeah, when they made like old school D&D, they put a Vorpal sword in there and it beheaded your enemy on a natural 20.
And what's funny is that Vorpal weapons carried through so many games.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can still see the word Vorpal commonplace. In fact, bring it back around to Minecraft.
Yep.
At least in the modded version. I don't know what mod adds it. I don't think it's a standard enchant that you can get in like the vanilla base game.
Yeah.
But there is a Vorpal enchantment
which beheads.
Do like massive critical strikes and sometimes drop mob heads. Yeah.
Well, there we go.
Yeah.
There we go. Little bit of history there for you. All right. So to bring this back around, what are ways for us to now take this out of these other genres and throw them into our other medias, I should say, and bring it to tabletop? What are the basic themes?
Okay, so a lot of these, especially like if you are learning like writing 101 sort of stuff, or if you're learning writing 201 or whatever, you're going to have your themes, your classic themes that are going to be phrased to you as man versus something.
Right.
Okay. Now, I've said a couple of these already in your prior examples.
Yeah.
Probably your biggest and easiest grab, if you're not going to have a villain, is going to be man versus environment. Okay?
Agree.
And that's going to come down into basically two of your big story types. It's going to be a survival story.
Sure.
Okay. So man versus environment, you've got a hostile environment to you. Maybe you are stranded on a mountainside. Maybe you're playing Traveler and just the ravages of space.
Yeah.
Hard vacuum is your antagonist.
It is terrible.
You've got to manage fuel. You've got to make sure that you're getting to the planet. If you get to the planet, are you going to be able to survive on that planet? Are you going to scrounge for resources? Are there solar, radiation storms that you have to avoid? There's a lot of stuff you can do in a story that gives the players conflict and drama and stress to kind of go through that have nothing to do with even a person getting involved. Okay. Your other one is exploration, and I think it kind of goes hand in hand with survival.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is, kind of like I said, is this a good planet? Or, is this, can we find the thing in the lost temple in the countryside?
Yep.
Dungeon crawls are essentially an exploration story.
Yeah.
You don't really have a villain in most dungeon crawls. The dungeon itself is an environment, but it doesn't care.
No. It's not in direct opposition to you. It is the opposition.
It's the source of the conflict, but it doesn't. It's not doing it on purpose. It's not a person with a motivation. Therefore, it is not a villain.
Correct. And in many ways, you can remove whatever you think in there is a villain, and the story continues because that's not what you're doing.
Yeah. You could replace the dungeon with a straight hallway with the MacGuffin at the end of it, or whatever.
Yep.
And
nothing changes.
The only thing that changes is the amount of traps in it.
Yeah. I think the ones that get a little more gray because they often feel like it is like the mystery or detective stories.
Yeah.
Where you're discovering something. It's not necessarily the environment, but you're uncovering a mystery, or you're studying something that occurred. There's going to be a lot of things that block you along the way, but nothing that is direct opposition until you get too close, and then the story shifts.
Yeah. I think back to like Sherlock Holmes, and I'm thinking more the classic,
Hercule Poirot. If I can say it right.
But like in mystery and detective stories, especially, like you'll have a lot of people who are shady, and you'll probably and you've obviously got the one who done it. The person who did commit the murder or whatever crime it is you're investigating. But
right.
It doesn't necessarily make them a villain in the sense as much as they're just they're the mark.
Right.
Now, whereas like if you're looking at Sherlock Holmes, like when you start getting into Moriarty, or Moriarty starts doing things directly in opposition to Sherlock to directly screw with him, he's a villain.
There was an interesting story that I was reading about, and unfortunately I can't remember the name of it. But it's about basically two hermetic mages who are trying to bring magic back to the world.
Okay.
Like it's been locked away. They aren't really at direct opposition to each other. They both want the same goal. The problem is one is in love with the other one's lover.
Oh.
And basically just wants them to look bad so that they can take the woman and go.
Yeah.
And that's the crux of the story, making that person a villain in the sense of what they're doing, but they're not in opposition to what the person's trying to achieve. It's an interesting twist on that kind of rivalry story.
Yeah.
But it walks that fine line between, are they just an antagonist or are they a villainous antagonist, just not a villain to the story?
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like if you're even walking that line of like, there's another person directly creating the conflict, but is he really doing it on purpose? Like,
yeah.
I mean, okay, look, he's still kind of a villain, you know,
yeah.
like.
And I think even if the villain is doing things to make them happen for the hero, make the events occur for the hero, that makes them a villain.
That still makes them a villain.
Because they're directly involved, and if they're removed, the story is not the same.
They're screwing with the hero on purpose, and if they're directly involved, none of these things are happening. So
now the next one I put on here is different than both survival and exploration because there's an element of stress added to it directly, which is a race or a delivery.
Yeah.
And you don't see these very often. Like they are. I've never really seen a good one in a tabletop played out. But I love the idea of them. I love the idea that there is a race, or that you have other people involved. They're antagonists without a doubt, but they're not opposed to you directly at all. They're all on the same race that you're in. If they're removed, the race is still the race. Like nothing's changed.
Yeah.
And that's now you start getting even closer to how things can be run.
I think it's a great example of a story with a boatload of antagonists, but no,
sometimes legitimately,
but no villains. Yeah,
yeah.
And then the last one you've got on here is just jobs.
Yeah,
I think
classic.
It kind of comes along with kind of the delivery thing, but it's not quite so destination based.
Yeah.
And that's like Shadowrun is built exactly around this gameplay loop of like you're hired to do a job. Okay, sure, you're going to be raiding, Renreiku this time around, but is Renreiku the villain? I don't know. I mean, probably not. They're just an entity.
Right.
In cyberpunk dystopias, the corporations aren't really villains as much as they are forces of nature. And if Renreiku weren't there, as technology would just take their place.
So, an interesting point, because we had to come back to this for a second. Overwatch adds Sebulba to the whole race concept. And in my personal opinion is this. He had to win the race. He didn't have to beat Sebulba.
Yeah.
So remove Sebulba. Okay.
So Sebulba's an antagonist. He's just there to screw with them, but he still had to win the race. Yep.
Just a rival.
Yep.
Just a rival. A crappy rival, but a rival. Yeah. But I still stand behind that jobs are the story.
Yeah.
That is what you're doing.
Yeah.
Whether it's a bunch of gangs or Renreiku, like you said, or anyone else involved, it doesn't really matter. Because, again, you still have to complete the job.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the end, that's how you get paid.
Absolutely.
So,
I kind of want to tack one here at the end. Like, my current game doesn't have a villain.
That is very true.
I've got the Fighters Guild working security for the mages, while the mages go on an exploration quest.
And that has literally been the plot of the entire game from the beginning.
Yeah. you guys work security for the mages while the mages do mage stuff.
Yep.
I mean, you guys got to do a lot of ass beating in the first act.
We did, but at the same time, that was the request. It was, hey, go take care of this problem, grab some mages to go with you.
Yeah.
And now it's, hey, the mages need to grab a few fighters to go with you because there may be problems.
Right.
And that's cool. That's great.
But that was a plot hook from session 0, so you guys knew that was going to be the format of the game.
No, and I think it works really well.
Yeah. But the fact is, though, is that, again, it's an exploration story. At least currently at this juncture, there's no villain,
Yep.
For it. You've just got kind of a lot of things on the table. Closest thing we've got to a villain is I have started the Kung Fu Hustle plot with your wife's character, Karu.
Yep.
We have a bunch of Khajiit ninjas
which I love
from a rival clan.
Yep.
And like I said, I still have to go, and I keep saying I have to do this. I have to go and binge watch 3 Kung Fu movies.
You do. You really do.
And just get some good ideas for just some really tropey things to throw in.
Oh, yeah. And how they move into scenes, what brings them into scenes.
Yeah.
Those types of things.
One trope I'm super excited to throw in there is the biggest damn warrior you've ever seen walks into the bar.
Yep.
That one where the protagonist throws a flurry of blows into their stomach and they just look at them. and then they take one swat and they go flying across, you
Yeah,
know?
breaks through 2 walls and
Yeah,
covered in dust, and they're like, oh, you know.
Right.
You're minorly stunned.
Inexplicably shirtless and hairless, you know?
Yeah. Or you have the guy who stands up and keeps rising, like doesn't stop rising until they hit like a beam.
Yes.
And then they slough off whatever the minor cloak that was on them, and they're literally rippling, and they have like an 18-pack, you know, going on the front and the back, you know?
Yep, I need that trope in there. But anyways, I digress. Alright, so where are we? What do conflicts look like when they don't have a villain?
Yeah,
so
and I think
we've described what the themes of these things might be, what the shape of them might be, but how do they actually play out? What can you do without a villain?
Well, I think you have effectively 3 direct, I guess, points to look at. Whether it's an event, so maybe it's a war that's going on. So it's an event that's occurring around the characters or around the protagonists in this case. You know, is it famine? You know, is everyone starving? You know, and so they're having to deal with that within the landscape. Is there an apocalypse going on? Is something changing in the world in such a way that there's no direct control over this? These events are just occurring. You know, magic is failing or magic is coming back. You know, and so these types of things are world events that can be very global. They can present a lot of moments and a lot of direct challenges for the players. But it doesn't have to be that scale of an event. It could be just as simple as a joust. You know, you're going to compete in a joust, and your team is 2 jousters and a bunch of, you know, your healer, your hype person, and it's about getting favor and respect, you know? And that's the key to it, is that it is the event that is occurring and then the story that happens around that event. I always come back to the school analogy because, again, it's a very small scope. It's very easy to define.
Sure.
There are not necessarily villains in the school. There don't have to be. But it could just be, you know, it's the presidents of the school. They're going to, you know, the president of council. So you've got people running for it. You've got to get people to, you know, recognize and respect. You know, all of those things come into play to see how do you get your friend to become city council, you know, or civic president of your school. Like, again, it's a small thing, but it's an event that can occur. We then have the second level of our second piece, which is stressful or complicated moments.
Yeah.
You know, a wedding is going on. There's a lot that can happen at a wedding. Both positive, negative, and weird all at the same time. You've got running a restaurant. We just had that.
Jiangxi.
A whole section of the game is devoted to nothing but complications and stressfulness of running a restaurant.
Yeah.
You know, there's no villains in that.
In the racist 1920s, nonetheless.
Again, but that's part of the feel that sets the tone.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no different to say that you couldn't just be running, like, I don't know, a McDonald's in these days.
Yeah.
You know, and the things that happen. There are multiple games. Burger Time. Is there a villain in Burger Time?
Well, it's an Atari game from 1984, so.
But there are literally games thrown at the same thing where you're handling a situation as best as you can.
Yeah.
What events change the characters in that sense?
Yeah, but I think like that this one especially, like, because it comes back to a lot of your stressful, complicated moments are going to be things like your survival games. You know, your exploration games, because like. Okay, guys, we're running low on air and food, and we are in the middle of the blackness of space. What do we do?
Yep.
You know?
Yeah.
Well, there's one person offering us a super shady job, and the good news is it'll put, you know, put food on our plates and fuel in our tanks, but the bad news is we might not live to spend the money.
Yep.
What do we do? That's a great example of a stressful situation that, again, doesn't really have a villain, you know?
Yep. And then straight up just challenges.
Yep.
Like, this works well for short games, but at the same time, it can sit right in the middle of a game as well. Something with an actual plot where you're just like, I need something different that doesn't affect my plot. Challenge is the greatest way to go with that. We talk about them all the time. Escape rooms, the Temple of Doom, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Dungeon crawls.
Dungeon crawls are great. Dungeon
They're
crawls
great
are great examples of challenges.
Yeah, running a race. Sure. Or a series of them. You have to do this one, this one, this one, this one. There you go. Some
sort of physically or emotionally taxing situation that has a goal at the end of it that you have to strive for.
Exactly. So it doesn't have to be as complicated. It can be quite simple. And again, all of these can layer to make up what you want to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that I put in here that I think, for at least me, feels important, especially because we do have a heavy D&D focus within our podcast. A lot of our members are D&D people.
Oh, sure. I mean, there's a lot of broad D&D focus in the community
and I think that one of the things that sticks out in my head is the need to slow down experience and advancement. Make it milestone, and I'll feign to say it, or not at all. Because players are then not focused on it as a goal or a reason to move on. Like, they're not doing the thing, because D&D is a story about becoming godlike in power, not defeating anything idealistic. It's when the XP pours in, that's what they're looking at as the goal, to get more XP to become more like a god.
Yeah, and typically, and again, not always. I don't want to stereotype every single D&D story here, but I would say D&D stories are typically have a villain to them. You know, they do have a big bad evil guy. It's kind of where the big bad evil guy trope is kind of cemented itself, especially in tabletop role playing. And oftentimes the reason why we seek advancement, the reason why we seek power, is not because it enables a character's story, but because it allows us to, in that sort of very gamey, very, video gamey sense, to level up so that we can conquer the next challenge. You know, I need a +5 sword because I'm going to need it to defeat the villain. Well, if there's no villain, what do you need to level up for? You know? We're going to focus a lot more on just the challenges of what life is like out here in the wilderness, etc., etc. You don't really need, 7th level spells for that. Like, you can tell a lot of really great stories at lower levels, and freezing your XP or doling it out very carefully shifts that focus from I need power so I can overcome everything and win the game to, okay, I'm just focusing on the here and now. And, I mean, I think that can be a little dangerous. I mean, you definitely want to talk to your characters, or say your players about this.
Without a doubt.
That you are telling that type of story, because I have been in stories before where, like, that wasn't really discussed, and we're, like, 8 game sessions in, and we're like, when are we going to level up at all?
Right.
Like, is there any advancement in this game?
Right.
Oh, it is, but it's really slow.
Yeah. But, I mean, advancement occurring when the players have examined and discovered or satisfied the plot allows them to then focus on that. For instance, if you guys found the MacGuffin, like, that was the whole point, and that's when advancement occurs. Now you know what creates the goals and leverage, and helps remind you what the next thing to do is.
Sure.
Give the biscuit when the task is completed.
Yeah.
Or when something good is done. I mean, we talk about this as far as what games teach you. D&D doesn't teach you to role play. Like, it doesn't give you the benefits when you role play. It gives you the benefits when you murder things.
Yeah. It's, I mean, if you don't do milestone XP, your experience is literally the metric by which challenge rating is measured off of, by which encounters are balanced around, and it is the metric by which you advance, is still killing enemies. And I mean, I know there are suggestions for, like, you also give experience for overcoming this or discovering a secret or whatnot.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, the core mechanic still, even in 5th edition, is kill enemies, gain experience,
Yeah. So the second part of this is the study of the character. Now, we kind of brought this up when we were talking about Ultima 4 and some of those. But I want to preface very cleanly that this is a study of the character, not the player. You need to derive from the characters what their wants, needs, concerns, and struggles are. To be able to then present those challenges to them in some way. Now, they're not traditionally mechanical. These are These aren't resolved with rolling dice. These are emotional or social or moral challenges that are being presented, so that you can answer the question of who the character is deep down.
Mm-hmm.
There are some things about this that make it very challenging, and I'll flat out say it, that players tend to play versions of themselves because it's easy.
Yeah.
And because it's natural to do so. So you run the risk that you're challenging your player and not your character.
Yes.
So you can set these things in motion, even sometimes between two players, and having, like, this player wants money real bad, and this player believes in chivalry and trust and honor, and the issue that you run into then is now you've got player versus player, and that causes risks at any table if they aren't prepared to remember that this is character and character.
Yeah, agreed.
So clear communication when doing anything like this is super important.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say even more so than your obvious player versus player sort of things. You want to worry more about storyteller versus player.
That, yeah,
because like you said, people tend to play versions of themselves.
Yes.
And so if we're gonna dive into what is Theodane's motivation for doing this, and just how big of a jerk is he gonna be if we put him in such a situation, we need to make sure there needs to be communication at the table that this is the storyteller wanting to examine Theodane, and not Sara wanting to call Rob a bit of an asshole.
Yeah, exactly. Like that, and that's a hard line to try and create without a lot of communication and a good understanding and continued communication story to story.
Yeah.
That recheck of, hey, how are we doing? Was this fun? Is this something you continue wanting to do? Because a lot of times, like, I've been in games where I have been examined and been like, this is neat. I like to continue this. And then start, at the end, they're like, dude, you were pretty deep into this. Oh yeah, I was. I'll see you next week. It feels sometimes like therapy in some ways, because you're getting to do more than just be a god.
Yeah, sure.
You're getting to play with that, with those other aspects, and it is dangerous. It's why X cards are a really good thing.
Well, sure, absolutely. I mean, ostensibly, what we're talking about here, again, kind of getting back to the actual names for these themes, is a character deep dive like this is called a man versus self theme. And where it's the character having to look within themselves and find that conflict there within their own psyche, and that. Especially when you think that a lot of players are playing versions of themselves, it does turn into I need to look at Sara needs to look at herself right now,
right,
and figure out why the hell Ravana the Snow Witch just did what she did,
Yeah, because you don't want to, because a lot of times, as a storyteller and even as a player, you don't recognize it until it's happened.
Yeah.
And you have to be prepared to have that. I mean, some of the things that kind of come out of this, at least as we're talking with stories, we're dealing with setting the characters in those kind of themes, you have stories of hope. And some of those can come from a very terrible place. Those terrible places can be triggering. They can be fantastic, but they can also expose a lot of concerns, and hopelessness. Keeping a family or a team together, that's a huge one.
Yeah.
It's an investment that has to happen, but once it's happened, how many people start to feel really weird when another party member passes? If it's been a year of playing with them, the player is still there, but that character is not.
Sure.
And that makes it very challenging. Again, just sometimes getting to somewhere and making it back safely is a thing. That stress of the return.
Oh yeah, I've talked about it before on the show. So if you're a long time listener to the show, I'm sorry. This is the third time I'm going to tell this story, at least. But I was playing Skyrim a handful of years ago, and I had gone in and loaded up a bunch of mods. One of the mods was a realistic needs mod that made you have to like sleep and eat and stuff like that, and it would affect your stats, your gameplay. And another one was called Frostfall, and what Frostfall added in was things like hypothermia. And when you're running around the frozen north, like if you end up in ice cold water with icebergs floating around in it, instantly fills your hypothermia stat. And like if you don't get near a fire, and which would warm you up and to dry you off and stuff like that, like if you don't take care of that, like your vision starts blurring, your stamina won't regenerate, you'll start losing health, and eventually you will just die, you know? And so it encourages this very survival-like gameplay, and so I decided, for those of you who know the map, I was going to walk from Winterhold to Windhelm. With major colleges.
Yeah, you brought this up a few times,
Yeah, and man, I'll tell you what, I only fought like a couple of wolves and I think like a bandit or two on the way down there, but I almost froze to death on that journey, and that was some of the most fun I've ever had playing Skyrim. Was just, I didn't have anything to do with the monsters I was fighting. It was literally just like, I was almost glad to see the wolves, because I was freezing to death in the middle of a snowstorm, and I thought maybe a good tussle with some enemies would help get my blood pumping again, and it forestalled it, but it did not increase it.
Yep.
I ended up having to duck into this little dungeon. I didn't have the appropriate key for it, so I could only get into the very entrance of it, trying to warm myself by a little torch. You know, I mean, these style of stories can breed great drama.
Very much so. Very much so. So, one of the things that really kind of comes off of this is what systems already support this? Like, are there systems out there that do it? And I would flat out say yes.
Oh, there's a ton of them.
There's a lot of systems that support this mechanic specifically. I mean, Savage World does it directly. You take a hubris, you get stuff for doing things with it, or hindrance within that. Powered by the Apocalypse, you write it into your character story. Like, it's part of who you are and how you advance.
Your little bonds and conflicts and stuff like that. And resolving those bonds gives you advancement. 7th Sea, you have a hubris that you will
straight
pick. If you play into your hubris, or sometimes when the storyteller calls for it, and kind of invokes the hubris, you're awarded a drama die for it.
You brought up Fate.
Fate. Your storyteller will compel aspects in Fate, and thereby giving you, basically invoking some sort of negative aspect of your character, but rewarding you with a Fate token. It's almost directly what happens in Savage Worlds.
I mean, Vampire the Masquerade is roleplay heavy in the fact that it even has nature and demeanor, as well as flaws.
But but at the same time, you're so. Role-playing your nature and demeanor, which aren't necessarily bad things, but you will regain willpower points through those. Your flaws, you gain character build points by taking flaws. They offset certain things, so your character becomes stronger for having taken a weakness elsewhere. And oftentimes those flaws will allow you to regain willpower in some sort of way also by role-playing into them. And then Mouse Guard.
Yeah, you have traits, or not traits.
Traits, that's correct,
that are both positive and negative.
Right, you can use them to hinder fellow guard members, and in doing so, you earn checks, which are kind of like experience. It's difficult to explain, but
it's an advancement.
If you want to know more about Mouse Guard, we did a system spotlight.
We did dive into it, but it leans directly into it, and it's you making active decisions with that,
right? To hinder somebody else and throw a complication into it. Yeah,
correct. So these help get your players thinking about their flaws of their character, and can easily give you the inroads as a storyteller to start pushing that through into the story elements and the plot themes as a whole.
Exactly. So like, it's kind of when we discussed D&D a little bit earlier, where like D&D doesn't really have a mechanic for flaws. They've got those background questions of like, what is your drive? What is your flaw? But I've never really actually seen anybody even use those.
Well, and the thing is that within those, and they suggest like these are the things you use them for. The only thing that they do for you is give you inspiration.
Yeah.
Which you get once until you spend it. Which all it does is give you a mechanic to kill things better, or to to roll dice better.
And I think this, like, especially in D&D games, because D&D does not have a mechanic to ask your players to actively put flaws or hindrances or whatever on their sheets to think about the negative aspects of what their characters are.
Mm-hmm.
In settings like that, especially if you're not used to that sort of thing, players can be blindsided pretty easily when the DM wants to explore or exploit a character's weakness, since they're not actually your players may not actually realize their character has a weakness. You know, if their only experience is through D&D and you've never been asked to write down what your character's biggest, flaw is, you wouldn't think about it. And your whole point of the game is achieving godlike power. It's we're level 15. Let's go punch Tiamat. Your character's a bit of a jerk might come out of left field.
Yeah.
I mean, you shared with me a story earlier about a storyteller who admittedly sprung this on his players, and I would not suggest doing that.
No,
so
never.
We're going to preface this story by saying, don't do this, but ran a deep character exploration story, essentially examining what his characters would do with extreme amounts of power, and the answer to that was, become murder hobos.
Yeah.
And one player figured it out?
One player along the lane was just like, as they were continuing this, and like people were starting to effectively it was before The Boys came out on TV, or I think was even a comic, that the guy had done this, and really just wanted to kind of examine superhero effective logistics in D&D. Like you start out as zeros, eventually you're going to get to a point where things aren't a problem anymore, and they really weren't. Like they were bulldozing through things without an issue. But the locals, some of them worshipped them, some of them feared them, some of them straight up hated them and just didn't like them at all. And it wasn't until one of the players basically stepped forward and was just like, I'm done with this. I can't hang out with you guys anymore. And did it in-game. Like, their character just wasn't able to do it. Like, all you guys do is go around murdering. Like, because you can. Like, nobody's going to stop you. You walk into a town, and you can pretty much do whatever you want. Seduce whatever you want, use magic, use weapons, effectively antagonize guards. Just make your way through whatever you want to do, however you want to do it. That's not life. That's being a bully. You're being a jerk, and I'm not going to stand for it. And, like, I'm out. And, like, well, you're going to roll up a different character? No, I'm out. Like, I don't want to be part of the story anymore if this is where you guys are going with it. And they're like, well, I mean, you're missing the point, because that's the point of the story is, like, we're here and we're large. Like, we're living it. And the storyteller was like, okay, they clearly...
They've made their choices.
They've made their choices, so I'm presenting that. And he ended the story, like, 2 sessions later, because he realized that they didn't learn from it what he was expecting them to learn, which is any kind of level of humility. They just basically kept bulldozing and wanted to continue bulldozing. They kept wanting to find what was the next bigger thing to kick the butt of and become the new god of. So, yeah, it was interesting. But again, he didn't discuss it with them. He just let it happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Sad, but true. I'm going to take just a minute before we jump into questions, because Hulavu brought up an interesting point. A recent game, Horizon Zero Dawn, which is the story of Aloy and a apocalyptic world. Now, it is arguably a little bit of a sandbox game. It doesn't start as a sandbox game. You're presented plot from the beginning that this world is full of robots, and you are a person who is kind of shunned by your community because of how you're brought into the community, and then you're kind of presented as a unique person to go and solve to figure out what's really going on. And at that point, you're kind of just available to do whatever you want. The plot's there, but it's lingering. Spoilers, it's been out for a while, so too bad. If you don't want to know, skip ahead a couple minutes here in the podcast. But effectively, there is a villain who sits in it. And I would agree with Hulavu. The villain is hidden for the first part of the story because they're the ones generating this stuff. But the villain shifts. There isn't just one villain in this story. It progresses, and the villain leads to another villain, which leads to another villain. There are many antagonists, but it is a good way that it is a good representation of how you can blend man versus X and a villainous story.
Sure.
And
Sure.
if you get a chance, do some reading, do some lore dumping if you want to see a good example of this. And I agree, Lulu. Thank you for bringing that up.
I think the important takeaway, especially like from that question, from the Marvel, Civil War sort of thing, as well, is that a lot of these things are not like black and white.
Correct.
Like a story is not just one thing,
Right?
And it does not need to stay that just one thing, even if it is for a period. Certain chapters of certain stories will shift from one to another to another to another.
Yes.
And your story may go from man versus man to man versus environment to man versus self, back to man versus man.
Yeah.
And then man versus God.
Yeah. And the other thing that, and I kind of said this earlier, is that if you are good at doing stories without a villain, if you can master this and understand your players and understand how to make a world feel challenging and involved,
and how to find conflict in seemingly everyday things like the environment or a sticky political situation or something like that, without having to point at a person and go, that mustache twirling jerk over there is the source of your ire.
Yeah, you can then know how to do a villain better.
Yes.
And how to make them feel way more at home with where they're at, using that environment to their advantage to just handle situations differently.
Well, also, even just your average villainous behavior of, ha ha ha, I'm trying to screw you over and get the MacGuffin before you do for my own nefarious plan, becomes so much more complicated when you can throw in environmental factors, when you can throw in political factors, et cetera, and you get you get a very layered story.
Yeah,
very
involved.
It's not just we need to go punch the mustache twirling dude. It's we need to punch the mustache twirling dude, but we need to do it while measuring our oxygen and scavenging for food and making sure that we can do this fast enough that we can get there before him.
Exactly.
And not piss off the local political party, by doing these things on their territory or whatever,
Exactly. So it's a study. It's something that I think everyone should at least try. If you're new to storytelling, give it a shot.
Sure.
Throw a section in your story where your plot kind of just sets to the side for a little bit, and you do a little bit of this, where the villain is not involved.
Yep.
Have fun.
Yep. That's exactly what I'm doing in my game right now. No villain right now, but you will. Oh, trust me, you will.
So we have some questions.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to start off with Nevim. Nevim shot 3 of them at us.
Okay.
So do you need some form of conflict to make a compelling story? I am going to say yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to say so with an asterisk on it. Because I think there are compelling stories that are nothing but, just character dramas. I've read some very compelling stories that are essentially just two people hanging out talking, and somebody comes to some sort of character growth out of it. I love character studies like that. But, so, I think the asterisk goes on compelling story, not on conflict.
Yeah, I think you can do a compelling story without conflict. I think it is a challenge.
I think it's an extraordinary challenge, and I would dare say that in a tabletop RPG, you're going to have a lot more problem with that, because if you're writing it, you can carefully craft what each of those characters' journeys are. But if you're playing a tabletop where you only have control of the NPCs and you have 4 to 6 PCs at your table, they may have different ideas about what makes a compelling story and what a conflict is and stuff like that. So it's going to be very difficult to do.
I mean, I think the closest you would get to it is, unfortunately, something that wouldn't feel like a tabletop RPG, but you could, and that is you could do Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the tabletop game.
Yeah, it would be more of a story, one of those actually storytelling games.
Yes.
Where almost diceless, where you're just kind of,
Yeah. But having a Hamlet character who's an NPC going through a crisis, and your players are there to be the counsel and to assist through it.
Yeah.
And at that point, it is a different kind of examination. So
yeah, I would say conflict is probably necessary. I would focus on it. I wouldn't try to cut conflict out,
especially not in tabletop right now, unless you got decades to play with.
Yeah, exactly.
What are the pros and cons of a story without villains? Ooh.
I mean,
varied.
Your pros, I think, are the big one for me is that it allows for a lot more breathing room for to tell character-based stories.
Mm-hmm.
What a villain does is it gives you a focal point for your ire, for the thrust of your story. It gives your characters a target to shoot for, right?
Yeah, it is the mountain you must climb.
Exactly. Now, if you take that villain away, those eyes can turn inwards or they can turn around.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can put a lot more focus on your environment. You can put a lot more focus on your character group, on your NPCs and stuff like that, on the minor antagonists in the PC's lives and stuff like that, because they don't have that one big mountain looming in the distance that they need to surmount.
But I think that's also the thing is that if the point of the story is you must climb that mountain and do X at the top, it doesn't matter what you throw at them all along the path. They can wipe all of it out, and they still have to climb the mountain and do the thing at the end.
Well, I find especially kind of going back to the Skyrim thing I was telling you about. Like I found a lot of people say that the greatest thing about Skyrim is that you can just literally start the game and then just go off into left field, and you never have to touch the main story at all. You can just do side quests for hundreds of hours before ever touching the main story. And I always found that to be very difficult for me to do. Because I get into the story, right?
Yeah.
And so when you tell me that there is a world-devouring dragon that only I can stop, and that I need to stop the world-devouring dragon right meow, or they're going to devour the world, how am I doing side quests?
I feel that.
How am I going to be like, okay, I'll get to the world-devouring dragon, but right now there's a little boy who lost a wooden sword down a well, and I have to go fight some rats,
Yeah.
And I feel like this translates very well into at least my tabletop experience a lot of times, where it's like, yeah, okay, that's great that you've built this big, broad world with all these things that you are saying we can explore, but the big, bad, evil guy is going to do his big, bad, evil plot if we don't stop him. So how am I expected to stop and smell the roses? How am I expected to stop and give that shopkeeper the time of day when her daughter's gone missing or whatever? That doesn't have anything to do with me. I need to stop the world from ending.
Right.
So
I think for me, I would say pros and cons. So pros of, for me, the story without villains would be it's an open landscape that the players still can see, because again, it's about communicating what their goals are. If you know your goal is to get the job done, then it doesn't matter how they do it, and they'll come up with different ways to get through it to get to the end of that. I loved that about Shadowrun.
Yeah,
it made it very easy for myself as a player to think outside the box beyond hit everything with a hammer. And it also allows for a lot more freedom in who the characters can be. In that sense, you can do a lot more things with that. I think some of the cons is it does make it more challenging for you as the storyteller, because there's a lot more listening that has to happen. There's a lot more subjective thinking about how you're going to present things, because you can't just present a nail every time. You have to come up with what are they doing with this to get to their final destination. To get to that place. And keeping that place in your mind as a storyteller can sometimes be very challenging.
Yeah.
Because you're apt to change it. You're apt to wanting to shift to move the cheese for them. And the moment you do, they know it. They feel it, and the story changes without them realizing it.
Yeah.
So I think that's the take-by-way that I have for that.
All right. Next question is, do you know any tabletop RPGs emphasizing story without villains?
I don't think...
Again, I think Shadowrun is probably one of the best examples of it, because it's more of a job, it's more of a gig-based game than it is a villain-based game.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, Apocalypse World, from whence the actual game, from whence Powered by the Apocalypse comes, and then you got Mutant Year Zero, a lot of your post-apocalyptic games and stuff like that turn out to be man versus environment stories.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those are the two that come to mind off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, it's even City of Mists is another good example of that. Again, games where role playing is the key, and in building your character, you're building the story.
Yeah.
I think that's the ones you need to focus on. The more narrative based, those are going to be stories without direct villains. Masks is another good example of that.
Yeah, where a lot of the drama comes from how you deal with what's going on rather than what is actually going on.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
It's more of a man versus self sort of story.
Yeah, self versus self in some cases.
Or man versus society.
Yeah.
Man versus generational trauma.
Yep.
All right, Knox in the Box asks, how do you handle the, quote, imaginary enemy trope, where a perceived threat or antagonist is expected, but it turns out to not actually exist or revealed to be something else entirely? How do I handle the trope? Hopefully with style.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say that a lot of, if you're handling that trope, the best way that you can do it is by incident and accident. Meaning everything is coincidental that presents itself to the characters, and you let them come to conclusions on their own and only present facts. It is a hard thing. It feels a lot more like you're writing a mystery without saying that it's a mystery. They believe they are assured that the werewolf is the problem in the town, when in fact has nothing to do with the werewolf, or the Duke being a werewolf. It has everything to do with the fact that there are, wolves around this area that have been been here for, a long time, and they just know that this is the time to hunt. But it presents for a very different story, and it's all coincidence and accident.
I think, I've kind of done some stuff like this in the past. I think one of the big things that I would say to pull off the imaginary enemy trope is communication with your characters, or with your players. One of the things I like to ask at the end of my sessions is, what do you think is going to happen next session, or what would you like to see happen next session?
Yes.
In your mind's eye, what would make the next perfect move in this plot? Where do you want to see it go? And that's not in any ways an implied promise that it will go that direction. But what the question is designed to do is give me some insights as to what the player is thinking and what would excite them as a move or shift in the plot.
Right.
And I think you can use a lot of that information to kind of craft your like the red herrings and stuff like that that you're going to put into them. Like if they're like, oh, we got to go after this guy because he's absolutely, the one orchestrating all this stuff. You're like, oh, you think that guy's the one orchestrating it? Okay, maybe I play that up a little bit. Is there an example where or is there something I can do in my story to make it look more like that? Because clearly the player expects that player to be the villain, but he's not. Can I do it to make that a reveal for them?
Right. And how can I make that reveal as obvious that it is not? Like, what is the one thing that they see as being like the only way that it could not be him and be someone else? Kind of a situation. Like, it's you pull off the mask and expect this person to be under the mask, and they're not. And you're like, okay, that's not what we expected. Why is it this dude here? Yeah. Like, it's those types of things that are very challenging to pull off. Reveals are exceptionally hard to pull off. They really, really are. Because, again, your players have to have a lot of knowledge to make a reveal work. And I'm sorry, unless you're playing weekly and your players are very involved and they have their mind very fresh about the game, that reveal can come off very sour. And I think that's why those are left to the one-shots or to like a weekend game where one simple adventure where it begins with one thing and it ends with another. Your players are very trapped in that mind frame, and there's very few pieces that lead them to the finish where they say, oh crap, it wasn't what we thought it was at the beginning. It was the one-armed man. Crap, and we just let him go.
Or for me, one of the greatest reveals you can make in the imaginary enemy trope is, yes, it was me the whole time, but I was doing it all to get your attention, and now that I have it, can we talk? Like, good, you got my note.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, great, you caught me.
You don't want to kill us? No, I don't want to kill you. I was doing that because I needed someone who was capable of solving the mysteries I was putting out there, and you found me. So that's you. Cool. Now you're qualified to help me.
Exactly.
Here's what the real problem is.
Yep. Yeah, it's the slow clap ending.
Yeah.
So yeah, good point.
All right, so Tim Saucer asks, if you were to frame this around the generic types of conflict, man versus nature, man versus self, man versus society, are there any systems you think work particularly well for telling these kinds of stories? This is kind of the same question Nevim asked, in a sense. What systems deal well with these kind of stories? And
I think it comes down to, I wouldn't say are there good systems for man versus nature, man versus self, or man versus society directly. I'm going to kind of set that to the side. What I am going to say is this. Each one of those has a different feel to them. And that's, I think, what you need to really decide is, are your players prepared to have a stressful man versus nature game? If the answer is yes, focus on games that have that mechanic in them, because that is going to be the key. You're not going to give them don't give them the chance to make godlike characters that can ignore the nature.
Yeah.
Whatever the nature is, and I use that in a very global term.
It's always kind of stuck with me. Somebody on Reddit said this, and it's stuck with me ever since. Is that people make rangers in D&D games that are going to be man versus nature. And all of the ranger special abilities allow you to avoid nature.
Yeah.
It literally, skip the survival part of the game. Just take it out entirely. You've got a ranger. You solve it.
Right.
Successfully. Congratulations. Yep. Now get back to the combat.
Yeah, and I think that's the detriment to writing those types of stories, is that you have to engage the system, the mechanics of the system, to do man versus nature well.
Yeah, agreed.
To get that, so that's one thing. Man versus self, there are, like we talked about, there are games that present themselves to be that. Power to the Apocalypse does it well. I think Masks is another great game that presents yourself as a person. To a degree, even World of Darkness, with its humanity values, are presenting a world where when you challenge the self, regardless of what else is going on mechanically in the game, you could be a god, it doesn't matter. What matters is, did you just do something that was a bad move?
Crossed a line, yeah.
Did you cross a line? If you cross a line, did you do it with power? City of Mists literally checks you on that, like, oh, you've just stepped farther into that bad part of yourself. Okay, you've moved away. Another one was that we were that we had dealt with, and I can't think of it right now off the top of my head, where you get either closer to being human or you get closer to being your anthropomorphic. Is that City of Mist? And then the other one is I can't think of it. It's
either mythos or your mythos self.
Yeah.
Or
you're drawing in one direction or the other. So that's really yourself. So again, you're focusing on a game that the mechanics point to that.
Yeah.
Lastly, man versus society. I think this is again a hard one to have impact your players in a game where the mechanics don't present itself. Reputation is an important part of 7th Sea and can ruin you, can destroy your character. If society doesn't like you, eventually you become a villain. And you are no longer a hero and are removed from that part of the game. I think to a degree there is a mechanic in Savage World for this as well that I was reading. I don't think it's a direct mechanic. I think it's an optional mechanic. But that whole concept that you can gain effectively social flaws that will eventually put you in a standing of you're no longer a character. You are now you've now moved yourself over into a wild card villain.
That might be a setting special rule of some sort. I don't think it's in the standard rules, but I mean, that's a great thing about Savage Worlds is it's very modular.
Yeah.
It's a generic system, so do what you want with it,
But again, it's not so much like it doesn't matter in a man versus society sense how powerful you are. It matters what your standing is and the way society views itself.
Sure.
So that's the things that you need to think about when you're doing that is there a mechanic within the system that leans in that direction? And so really the only one that becomes a challenge to that is the man versus nature. That systems that are literally everything I do in this game makes me better at handling nature every step of the way as I advance, then you're not going to want to play that man versus nature.
Yeah, I think man versus nature plays out very well in systems that are have very low power curves.
Yeah,
where you are fragile and life is cheap.
Or games where it requires you to fail to grow, I think, is another way of looking at that as well.
Yeah,
because that compels the story. Like Mouse Guard has that.
Yeah,
and I think that compels the story to handle those situations differently.
Mm-hmm.
So there we go. That's my answer.
Yeah, I think first off, I agree with everything you said. But yeah, I would look for man versus nature, man versus self, and man versus society. I think a lot of these are very kind of introspective. You're not really good. Like I would look for games with mechanics that encourage failure or flaws or things like that. Like one of the big things I've really loved about Savage Worlds was just hindrances and bennies.
Mm-hmm.
You play your hindrance. It says it right on your character. You chose it during
Mm-hmm.
character creation.
Mm-hmm.
You said my character is flawed in this way, and this way. Cool. Yeah. But when you do that, you get a Benny for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Benny economy is supposed to flow.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to spend them freely, and I am supposed to give them freely.
Mm-hmm.
And what gives me impetus to give them is you role-playing your flaws.
Yep.
And I think any game system which you're going to find that sort of a gameplay mechanic that encourages you to play a flaw rather than minimizing your flaws because you need to be optimal and, min-maxed in all ways, you're going to find man versus nature, man versus self, and man versus society a lot easier to do because all three of those thrive in a character-driven environment.
Yep.
When you don't have as obvious of an external threat, man versus nature is, but nature doesn't care.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about nature as an antagonist is that it is dispassionate.
Yes.
The mountainside doesn't care that it just kills you. All it just knows is that it gets cold at night.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so the true conflict of man versus nature in that environment is, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
What decisions do you make?
Yeah.
And so really it's a question of what sort of man is it versus this nature.
Yep. No, I agree with that.
Find a game system that'll allow you to deep dive that.
Yeah. Well, we hope we answered your questions, and we always look for more when you guys get a chance. Pop in to our Discord and throw some questions at us, and they don't necessarily have to be topic direct.
Yeah.
Bounce some other. We've definitely had ones in the past that have been questions that actually get us to reach back a few episodes, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, we end every show with our Twitter and stuff like that. Twitter's usually pretty quiet and stuff like that.
Yeah.
If you don't want to join our Discord, I get it. Everybody's inundated. Excuse me. You apologize for the coughing, and I'm the one coughing now. I know everybody's inundated with Discords. Everybody's got a Discord nowadays, so you've probably got a billion of them going on. But if you're on Twitter, you can still shoot us your questions there.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
We'll definitely take them.
There's avenues. Shoot us your questions anywhere, and we'll answer them on the air.
Yeah,
so.
Totally. So next week it is September.
It is first Wednesday of September next week, so we are diving back into our 101s.
Yes, I think we're doing creating investment.
Yes, creating investment on how can new storytellers get players to care about their world, care about their story, care about their NPCs, and roll up their sleeves and get involved. You can find us on Twitter at @ST_Conclave. Listen to on Instagram at ST_Conclave. Listen to us live every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern at mixlr.com/storyteller-conclave. And join us up on our Discord, previously mentioned. You can find that link on our Twitter, as well as our website, storytellerconclave.com.
Yeah, if you're looking for other place to find us or to listen to us, go on to Storyteller Conclave and hit where to listen to us, and you'll see all of our links there on the side. They're all finally cleaned up, thank God. We'd like to thank our Patreon members, especially our name members who help us out every single month. Knox in the Box, Subjet, Sam, the Arcane Asylum, Sparkle Motion Veteran, Hulabu, and Sean. We really appreciate it. Our pre-show music is by Arcane Anthems. You can find that at patreon.com/arcaneanthems. Our intro music is Beyond the Warrior by Geefrog. You can find that at geefrog.bandcamp.com or on YouTube Music. And our outro music, which you're hearing right now, is Only Our Footprints in the Sand by Only Our Footprints in the Sand by Midair Machine. And you can find that at freemusicarchive.org.
Our big shout out as always to our families, Vicky and Sean. Thank you so much for loving and supporting us. All of our friends who've sat with us at our tables over the years, give these great stories to share with you, as well as you, every single one of our listeners. We love you guys so much.
Love you guys. Good night.